And our last speaker before the break, our final break of the day, is Dafna Bimstein. Dafna had her eyes set on this program since she graduated Claremont McKenna College in 2018 with a degree in biology. There, she focused her studies on coralline algae and its impacts from climate change. And for the next 5 years, she worked on different jobs, including coral reef restoration projects, data collection with Cal Coffee, and teaching scuba diving. She plans to dedicate her career to the intersection of conservation policy and marine research while hoping it requires her to be on or in the water often. Dafna is definitely a water woman, but don't be fooled. She is much more than that. She did an internship with the Fish and Game Commission this year to learn more about the policy side of ocean conservation. And she sat in the front row of ocean law and policy and asked lots of smart questions every single day. And she's going to also be the TA for the summer course this year that starts...
I can't leave.
That starts in 2 weeks. And so we're really excited to have Dafna sticking around for a bit and sharing all that she's learned and all that she has to bring to the next cohort of students in this program. The title of her presentation today is Under the Seagrass, Conserving Benthic Habitat in Underwater Cultural Heritage Sites During Marine Archeological Surveys. Welcome, Dafna.
Thank you. We're first all going to take one collective deep breath. Okay, I'm going to start by doing what I do best. I'm going to take you all on a dive. So grab a buddy, make sure to equalize, and don't stop breathing. Immediately, we see a meadow of seagrass. We see fish hiding within the blades, occasionally taking a bite or two. We see tiny organisms living on the surface of the leaves as well. If you don't see it, make sure to defog your mask. Seagrass is an eco-engineer, meaning it creates habitat that supports the local biome. Oh, look, a turtle! Looks like it's also benefiting from the habitat and food the seagrass produces. These meadows provide refuge, energy, substrate, nurseries, oxygen, and more. They support fisheries, sequester 10% of the ocean's carbon, and protect our coasts from erosion by slowing down waves and currents. They also have one secret superpower. They hide and protect our history. You see, we're not diving just any random dive site right now. We are currently in a sunken ancient port in Amathus, Cyprus. This site is protected under the UN as an underwater cultural heritage site, or UCH for short. The 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage defines UCH as all traces of human existence having a cultural, historical, or archaeological character, which have been partially or totally underwater, periodically or continuously for at least 100 years. This includes sites, structures, buildings, vessels, aircraft, vehicles, and their cargo, artifacts, human remains, and really any object of prehistoric character. It is estimated that more than 3 million shipwrecks and sunken cities lie on the ocean floor right now. Most of these historical lost relics are yet to be discovered and/or studied. Cultural heritage is inextricably linked to our modern culture. So what do we do when it's buried under delicate marine ecosystems, such as seagrass? Weighing the decision to excavate or probe for archaeological research in the presence of seagrass is even more concerning when seagrass abundance is already on a steep decline. Almost 1/3 of global seagrass coverage has been lost since 1879, and since 1990, their decline rate is 7%, which is equivalent to a football field every 30 minutes. 26% of global seagrass meadows fall within marine protected areas, making seagrass one of the least conserved marine ecosystems in the world. It is also important to note that seagrass beds have been incredibly difficult to replant, restore, and recover. Only 38% of seagrass restoration efforts were deemed effective and successful, according to a study in 2016. The sediment needs to be compact and stationary. And without established roots present, it's very uncommon for the seagrass to be able to settle and grow those roots and implant themselves properly. Otherwise, a wave or some current can come by and just simply uproot those seagrasses. This compact and stable sediment is imperative also for the preservation of buried archaeological sites. In addition to the environmental benefits that I've already mentioned, seagrass creates the perfect environment to protect historical remains. Compromising the integrity of these seagrass meadows in an attempt to uncover the UCH could inadvertently lead to destruction of not only the seagrass, but the actual archaeological artifacts that we wish to access and preserve. So what should archaeologists do? Do they trim it, like they do at the dive site that we're currently still diving in? Do they probe? Do they just excavate anyway? Trimming can be harmful to the seagrasses because it prevents them from photosynthesizing sometimes. Probing is usually great depending on where you choose to probe, but it could risk damaging the archaeological material. Excavating, even if you don't plan on removing any seagrass, will diminish water quality and risk smothering nearby meadows with sediment deposits. So I set on my capstone project to create a foundation that will inform a best practices guideline. My first step was a spatial analysis using ArcGIS Pro to identify areas under seagrass that potentially contain underwater cultural heritage. I used Puerto Rico as a case study due to its location in the Caribbean and its rich maritime history. So a little background on Puerto Rico. Its strategic location and potential for natural resources led to Spanish occupation in 1508. The island then functioned as a major military post for the next 400 years. Puerto Rico was the gateway to colonization of the Americas and globalization into our modern world. It played a pivotal role in the early European exploration of the New World, and its coasts are currently preserving a significant record of that maritime past post-European arrival. But the island wasn't always called Puerto Rico. That is its colonized name. It was actually Boriquen. We know from archaeological evidence that the indigenous community, the Taínos ancestors, had been living on Boriquen for at least 7,000 years. We also know that they traveled and traded with other Caribbean communities. The island's culture and history has been largely influenced by maritime practices, considering it is an island surrounded by other island nations. Therefore, I reconstructed the island's coastline to what it was 10,000 years ago. Due to drastic sea level rise, it is nearly certain that these lost lands carry an abundance of Caribbean indigenous history. We only need to look for them. With the help of the Human Ecology Lab here at Scripps, I used topographical data to shift the current coastline into its historic counterparts. This map right here was my first raw reconstruction. Very beautiful. And this is my final compilation that you can find on my story map. We're going to zoom into El Pasaje de Vieques on the eastern coast. The blue shading we see in this map represents land that would have been exposed 5,000 years ago, as well as major ports and harbors that may contain shipwrecks and other historical relics. I calculated 140 kilometers squared of potential UCH. We're going to rewind time by another 5,000 years to see the coastline from 10,000 years BP, or before present day. The change in sea level becomes quite stark when we see that significant increase in submerged historical land. The potential UCH went from 140 to 1,090 kilometers squared. None of this area has been surveyed by archaeologists yet, so there's an exciting amount of history and knowledge just waiting there. Things get really complicated when we factor in the seagrass currently hiding this potential UCH into consideration. I incorporated public data sets detailing their coverage into my analysis, as you can see in green. In total, there is at least 1,176 kilometers squared of seagrass meadows around the island. The red symbolizes the areas that overlap. That is 1,017 kilometers squared of seagrass covering potential UCH from 10,000 BP or sooner. 127 kilometers squared of that is from drowned lands within 5,000 BP. From my GIS analysis of Puerto Rico, I found that 91% of submerged lands from 5,000 BP or later overlaps with seagrass coverage data. That statistic jumps by 2% when we include the drowned land from 10,000 years ago. The takeaway here is that the vast majority of underwater cultural heritage is under seagrass. So marine archaeologists need to know about seagrass, and marine ecologists need to know about archaeology. Through this process, I found that there is crucial data missing. The figure behind me is a screenshot of public data sets of seagrass. On GIS, I could physically see where the seagrass was and how dense it was, but information on the specific species or even the genus was unreported. Additionally, while interviewing archaeologists from the Mediterranean, they told me that they don't know what seagrass they're looking at when scoping a site. Without species-specific information, it is nearly impossible to properly assess a site. Every species requires different conditions, different treatments, and recuperation techniques. Never mind that there are invasive species that we do not want to conserve. And they are present in Puerto Rico. So I pivoted a little. As part of my deliverables, I also created seagrass identification slates for 8 different species, both in English and in Spanish. They will soon be dropped off at dive shops in Puerto Rico, marine conservation groups, and sent to archaeologists working with UNESCO. In conjunction with these slates, I developed a data collection form for both recreational and scientific divers to report both seagrasses and UCH that they identify. A copy of some of these slates will be outside to look at during the break. Also, side note, please do not take them because these are the ones that will be sent. So if you took some, please put them back. So how can we ensure that seagrass beds experience the least disturbance possible when finding and accessing the buried underwater cultural heritage? To continue conserving marine habitats on top of archaeological sites, the first is using non-invasive surveys to locate and identify archaeological material. Next, we ensure we take ecological impacts into consideration during the planning process. And lastly, have a plan to restore and monitor the site post-operations while collaborating with seagrass ecologists. Remote sensing using high-frequency sonar has been proven to be extremely useful and accurate. In 2008, researchers in the UK successfully reconstructed Henry V's flagship with a seismic sub-bottom profiler, and were even able to identify features within it. In 2015, scientists in Israel tested the efficacy of that same technique on a buried shipwreck from 400 BC and found that it is indeed accurate. Of course, technology can and should be refined and improved. In the meantime, we must follow the UN's convention to prioritize in situ preservation of underwater cultural heritage. So essentially, leave it alone. If recovery is deemed necessary, using advanced sonar tech to pinpoint precise locations will mitigate large-scale damage. Ecological impact assessments, where researchers weigh the cost and benefits of potentially excavating a site, need to incorporate the direct and indirect benefits that seagrasses provide to the community in relation to the scale of the project. Lastly, if digging or extraction do take place, proper post-operation site management is vital for both the archaeological remains and the marine life. More research on seagrass restoration and conservation is really needed as well. Seagrass meadows safeguard historical artifacts, provide many environmental benefits, and serve as living records of human and climate history. Marine ecology and archaeology clearly have a symbiotic relationship, so we should translate that into actual collaboration between the two fields as well. Now, general comprehensive advice for conservation management is practically impossible, since every site will have unique characteristics, different species, different requirements, and different priorities. However, when seagrass or other eco-engineers are present, the guiding principle should be to err on the side of caution and avoid disturbance, thereby ensuring the integrity of both archaeological and ecological assets. And I'd like to take a moment to really thank my Capstone Advisory Committee. I could not have done this without you. As well as my PhD mentor, really mentors, Lauren and Eric, thank you so much for all of your help. And I'd also really like to thank UNESCO. They officially endorsed this project last Friday, so whoop, and my cohort mates. And I will take questions.
Great presentation. Can we reasonably predict the location of underwater cultural heritage sites? And if so, what are the odds that they exist around the coast of Greenland?
So in the Pleistocene epoch, back when we were in the Ice Age, sea levels were actually 120 meters shallower than they are now. And as the Earth warmed, that sea level started to rise a lot, which is why I did 10,000 years, because that's really when we start seeing a lot of evidence of humans, especially in Puerto Rico. So if we take that logic and apply it to the rest of the world, if sea level rose by 120 meters in those thousands of years, people were living in the coastlines. That's usually where a lot of people like to be because of all the resources that oceans provide and transportation. Back then there weren't airplanes, so there were a lot of people, Vikings, especially if you're talking about Greenland. Morgan, I'm not really sure if Vikings were there. To be honest, I'm not an expert on Greenland. But my educated guess would be that there is a lot of cultural heritage around ancient coastlines in general. And especially in places where we know that there has been people living there for thousands of years, there will be evidence of it. We don't know exactly where, though. That's why it's potential underwater cultural heritage. Thank you.
Hey, Dafna, really interesting presentation, something I think a lot of us haven't thought about before. Curious, what kinds of seagrasses can you find in Puerto Rico? And are there some species that are more quote unquote important than others?
Yes, I actually had to remove it from my slides for time-wise, but I have a list of all of the species from Puerto Rico. There are 5 main local ones and 1 major invasive one. The 2 most prevalent seagrasses in Puerto Rico are turtle grass and manatee grass. As their names suggest, this is the main food for turtles and manatees and a lot of other species in the area. And then the invasive species, Halophila stipulacea, I think that's how you say it. It came from the Red Sea and it's all over the world now and it smothers a lot of other species, and so that is a problem. So I would say that turtle grass and manatee grass would be our climax species.
That's great. And are there some seagrass restoration techniques that have been more or less effective that you researched?
Yes. So the restoration effort that has been most successful is called compressed succession. And it is when we place a species that is faster growing first as a pioneer species, essentially. So in Puerto Rico's case, it would be Halodual wrighti, which is shoal grass. And so we place that one, it grows a lot faster, and then once it's more established, then we bring in that climax species, which would be turtle grass or manatee grass, because they're a lot slower growing.
Great. Thanks so much, Dafna.